license and registration, now. All right, reaching for it. Down. Hands out, don't move.
Face the car, down.
All right. Put your hands behind your back.
The dashboard cam recorded every single second. What began as an ordinary traffic stop on a quiet Tuesday in downtown Chicago spiraled into a disaster that would drain millions from the city's budget and destroy several law enforcement careers. It kicked off with two cops walking up to a black SUV with dark windows, proceeded through the arrival of additional units with weapons ready, a man cuffed and pressed against the asphalt, and concluded with a revelation that left everyone involved wishing they'd simply kept driving. The person behind the wheel wasn't your average citizen. He was a federal agent who had full legal power to arrest them in return. Before I dive into this incredible story, let me ask you something real quick. Where are you tuning in from? Go ahead and drop your city or country down in the comments. And hey, if you're not subscribed yet, smash that subscribe button now. This channel delivers authentic stories the mainstream media won't give you the full picture on, and you definitely don't want to miss what unfolds next. Believe me on this. Deputy United States Marshal Anthony Hayes was heading home following a 12-hour shift. His entire day had been spent hunting down a fugitive who jumped bail on federal violations. The operation had gone off without a hitch. The takedown was textbook. Hayes was exhausted and eager to see his family. He was in his personal ride, a black SUV, cruising right at the posted limit down State Street. Officer Brian Reed and Officer Chris Wallace were working the same neighborhood in their patrol vehicle. They'd been clocked in for roughly 6 hours and had only issued 2 citations the whole day. It was a slow shift. Reed was at the wheel when he spotted the black SUV with those tinted windows. He mentioned to Wallace that the tint appeared too dark to meet legal standards. Wallace nodded in agreement. Reed activated the lights and siren. Hayes caught sight of the flashing lights in his mirror and felt his gut tighten, not because he had something to conceal, not because he'd broken any laws, but because he understood precisely how these encounters could unfold. He'd witnessed it happen to other black men. He'd reviewed the incident reports. He'd seen the footage. And now, despite being a federal law enforcement officer himself, he was about to live through it personally. He switched on his turn signal. He reduced his speed carefully. He guided his vehicle to the right shoulder and came to a stop. He lowered all 4 windows right away. He positioned both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock. He followed every protocol because he knew those protocols better than most folks out there. Reed and Wallace moved toward the vehicle from opposite sides. Reed approached the driver's window while Wallace took up position near the passenger side. Both officers kept their hands close to their firearms. This was standard operating procedure for any stop, but the atmosphere was already getting thick with tension. Hayes maintained his hands in plain view on the wheel. He stayed completely still. He didn't reach for a single thing. Reed requested his license and registration. Hayes responded in a steady, clear voice. He informed the officer of his status as a United States Marshal. He explained that his credentials were inside his wallet, located in his back right pocket. He mentioned that his service weapon was in a holster on his right hip beneath his jacket. He asked the officer how he'd prefer him to proceed. This is the moment things should have gone smoothly. This is when a quick verification would have resolved everything. But that's not how it played out. Reed didn't buy it. He assumed Hayes was making it up. He instructed Hayes to keep his hands on the wheel and remain motionless. Wallace headed back to the squad car and ran the plate. The vehicle registration came back to Anthony Hayes with 0 warrants and 0 red flags. Nothing questionable whatsoever, but the officers remained tense. Reed commanded Hayes to exit the vehicle. Hayes obeyed slowly, making sure his hands stayed visible the entire time. He stepped out onto the sidewalk. Reed immediately ordered him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Hayes attempted to clarify once more that he was a federal agent. He offered to allow them to confirm his credentials. He provided them with a direct line to the United States Marshal's office in Chicago. Reed wasn't interested in listening. He seized Hayes by the arm and began turning him around. Hayes stood taller and had more muscle mass than Reed, which only amplified the officer's anxiety. Wallace came around from the passenger side to help out. Now there were 2 officers attempting to restrain one individual who kept telling them he was on their team. Hayes reached a decision in that instant. He could push back and exercise his authority as a federal agent. He possessed every legal right to do exactly that. But he also understood that resistance, even justified resistance, could escalate to deadly force within seconds. He chose to fully cooperate and resolve things afterward. He placed his hands behind his back. Reed retrieved his handcuffs and locked them on Hayes's wrists. They bit into his skin. Hayes informed him of this. Reed made no adjustments. Wallace conducted a pat-down of Hayes and instantly detected the firearm on his hip. He called out "gun" in a loud voice. Reed shoved Hayes forward and downward. Hayes dropped to his knees, then flat on his stomach onto the concrete sidewalk. His face made contact with the frigid pavement. People were observing by this point. Pedestrians halted on the sidewalk. Motorists reduced speed as they went by. Somebody grabbed their phone and began filming. The body cameras on both officers were running. The dashboard camera in the patrol car was capturing everything. Every single thing that transpired next was documented from multiple perspectives. Wallace extracted the weapon from Hayes's holster. He also located the badge and credentials in Hayes's back pocket. He examined the badge. He studied the credentials. He read the words "United States Marshal" printed prominently on the identification card. He noted the official seal. He saw the photograph that matched the individual on the pavement in front of him. Wallace fell silent. He displayed the credentials to Reed. Reed stared at them for an extended moment. Neither officer spoke a word. Hayes remained face down on the sidewalk in handcuffs, and both officers abruptly grasped that they'd committed a devastating error. Think they apologized immediately and helped him up? Type yes if you believe they corrected things right away, or no if you think they dug themselves deeper. The answer just might shock you. Rather than releasing Hayes immediately and offering an apology, Reed made another catastrophic choice. He radioed for backup. He informed dispatch that he'd stopped a vehicle and detained somebody claiming federal agent status, but that the situation felt off to him. Within a matter of minutes, 2 additional patrol cars showed up. 4 more officers stepped onto the scene. Hayes was still pressed against the ground, still wearing handcuffs, still face down on the concrete. He maintained his composure but stayed firm. He reiterated that he was a deputy United States Marshal. He told them to contact his office. He rattled off names of supervisors. He recited direct phone numbers. But the officers had committed to their approach now, and owning up to an error in front of 6 officers, plus an expanding crowd of onlookers, seemed more difficult than continuing down this path. One of the recently arrived officers, a sergeant, assumed control of the situation. He glanced at the credentials Wallace passed to him. He looked down at Hayes on the pavement. He questioned Reed and Wallace about what had transpired. They described pulling over the vehicle for illegal window tint. They claimed the driver said he was a federal agent but acted nervous. They explained they'd detained him for officer safety while confirming his identity. The sergeant placed the phone call. He dialed the United States Marshal Service office in Chicago. Someone picked up. He laid out the situation. There was an extended pause on the other end. Then the voice on the line asked for their location and verified that Deputy Anthony Hayes was in fact one of their agents and was off duty heading home. The voice additionally noted that Hayes was among their most highly decorated deputies with more than 15 years of service. The sergeant's complexion went ashen. He disconnected the call. He directed the other officers to remove the handcuffs right away. Hayes was pulled to his feet and uncuffed. The entire detention had stretched nearly 20 minutes. Hayes stood up, dusted off his clothing, and extended his hand for his weapon and credentials. The sergeant returned them and began attempting an explanation. Hayes interrupted him. He had no interest in hearing excuses. He requested all of their badge numbers and names. He made it clear that he'd be submitting a formal complaint to their department, the mayor's office, and the Department of Justice. He also stated that the whole incident represented a textbook case of racial profiling and unlawful detention of a federal officer. Reed attempted to debate the point. He insisted they were simply performing their duties. He suggested Hayes should have some understanding since he's also in law enforcement. He characterized it as just a mix-up. Hayes looked him straight in the eye and posed a straightforward question. He asked whether Reed believed they would have slammed a white federal agent face down on the concrete and abandoned him there for 20 minutes. Reed offered no response. Hayes got in his vehicle and drove home. He phoned his supervisor during the drive. He submitted an official report that very evening. The United States Marshal Service responds to attacks on their deputies with extreme seriousness. Whether those attacks originate from criminals or from fellow law enforcement, the report ascended the chain of command rapidly. The following morning, the chief of police got a call from federal authorities. The conversation was not cordial. The caller insisted on a comprehensive investigation, a public apology, and disciplinary measures against every officer who participated. The caller also brought up that the United States Marshal Service was weighing federal charges against the officers for civil rights violations under color of law. The police department initiated an internal investigation. They obtained all the camera recordings. The dashboard camera captured the complete stop. The body cameras documented everything the officers witnessed and heard. The footage from the bystander's phone had already been uploaded online and was spreading like wildfire. The investigation uncovered numerous violations of department policy. Reed and Wallace failed to adequately verify Hayes's credentials when he initially identified himself. They applied excessive force by forcing him to the ground when he was following all instructions. They failed to release him right away once his identity as a federal agent was established, and the sergeant who showed up as backup failed to assert control of the scene and rectify the situation with appropriate speed. Reed and Wallace were suspended without compensation pending the investigation's conclusion. The sergeant was issued a written reprimand. The chief of police conducted a press conference and delivered a public apology to Hayes and to the community. He described the incident as unacceptable and contrary to the department's values. But the harm had been inflicted. Hayes filed a federal lawsuit against the city and the officers as individuals. He sued for civil rights violations, unlawful detention, assault, battery, and emotional distress. The lawsuit documented every second of the stop and contended that it would never have occurred if Hayes had been white. The city's legal team reviewed the evidence. They watched the recordings. They read the documentation. They assessed the risk of proceeding to trial compared to reaching a settlement. They recommended the city settle. 18 months following the traffic stop, the city paid Hayes a settlement of $3,200,000. Reed and Wallace were terminated from the police department. Both officers also faced federal charges for violating Hayes's civil rights. They ultimately entered guilty pleas to lesser charges and were sentenced to probation, community service, and lifetime prohibitions from law enforcement employment. This story isn't one of a kind. It occurs more frequently than most folks understand. The only atypical element is that the victim in this particular case happened to be a federal agent equipped with the expertise, resources, and standing to mount an effective challenge. But thousands of other black men get stopped, detained, mistreated, or worse by police officers who form conclusions based on race instead of evidence. Hayes later sat down for an interview with a national news organization. He mentioned that the most terrifying aspect wasn't being handcuffed or forced to the ground. The most terrifying aspect was recognizing that even with all his experience, even with his badge and credentials, even with his years of dedication to his nation, he was still perceived as a danger first and a human being second. He discussed the conversation he'd had with his teenage son following the incident. He explained to his son that following all the rules doesn't always guarantee your safety. He told his son that showing respect and complying doesn't always stop things from getting worse. He told his son that the system has serious problems and that it requires people dedicated to repairing it from within. Some individuals criticized Hayes for accepting the settlement funds. They argued he was merely attempting to profit from the circumstances. But Hayes contributed $1 million of the settlement to organizations providing legal assistance to victims of police misconduct who lack the means to pursue justice. He retained the remainder to cover his attorney fees, taxes, and to establish a college fund for his kids. Reed and Wallace conducted interviews as well. They insisted that they were just performing their jobs and that the entire situation was exaggerated. They claimed they would have handled anyone identically, without regard to race, but the camera recordings presented a different narrative. The footage revealed hesitation, uncertainty, and an unwillingness to acknowledge evidence that challenged their original assumptions. What do you think would have happened if Hayes hadn't been a federal agent? Would this story have concluded the same way? Really consider that question. The incident resulted in policy modifications within the Chicago Police Department and in multiple other departments nationwide that learned about the case. Fresh training was rolled out on proper verification procedures for law enforcement officers from other agencies. New protocols were established for de-escalating traffic stops when the driver identifies as law enforcement, and new accountability mechanisms were added to guarantee officers experience genuine repercussions for racial profiling and excessive force. But policies and training are only effective if officers genuinely adhere to them. And officers only adhere to them if they're convinced there will be consequences for failing to follow them. The dismissals of Reed and Wallace transmitted a signal to other officers in Chicago and beyond. The message came through clearly. Violating someone's civil rights, particularly a federal agent's rights, will destroy your career. Hayes kept working as a United States Marshal. He admitted he considered resigning after the incident. He contemplated pursuing a different profession where he wouldn't need to wear a badge that failed to shield him when he needed protection most, but he made the decision to remain. He said that walking away would feel like allowing Reed and Wallace to come out on top. He said the system requires decent people who comprehend its shortcomings to stick around and work to repair it. He also transformed into an advocate for police reform. He addressed community gatherings, police academies, and government hearings. He shared his story repeatedly because he wanted people to grasp what racial profiling actually looks like in practice. He wanted officers to hear directly from one of their colleagues about the destruction they cause when they allow prejudice to supersede training and rational judgment. The city paid $3,200,000 to resolve Hayes's lawsuit, but the actual expense was substantially higher than that figure. The police department's credibility suffered damage that persisted for years. Community confidence, which was already at a low point, plummeted even further. Recruiting new officers became more challenging because quality candidates didn't want to join a department associated with this type of incident. And the department had to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra training and policy overhauls. Reed and Wallace forfeited their careers, their reputations, and their prospects in law enforcement. They both had difficulty securing employment after being fired. Their identities were forever linked to a case that generated national headlines. Every prospective employer who searched their names online would discover articles describing how they detained a federal agent, threw him face down on the pavement, and refused to acknowledge their error, even when the proof was staring them in the face. Hayes received his settlement payment, but he also acquired trauma that doesn't vanish simply because a check gets deposited. He said he still experiences anxiety whenever he notices police lights in his rearview mirror. He said he still recalls the sensation of cold concrete pressed against his face and tight handcuffs digging into his wrists. He said he still feels anger when he reflects on how long he was left on the ground after the officers realized they'd made a blunder. And the public received another justification to distrust police, another recording of officers treating a black man like a suspect first and investigating later. Another illustration of a system that fails to safeguard everyone equally. This traffic stop consumed less than 30 minutes from beginning to end, but its consequences will persist for the remainder of Hayes's life, for what's left of Reed's and Wallace's careers, and for the community's relationship with police for years ahead. The incident demonstrated something that many people already recognized, but that some individuals refuse to acknowledge. Being black in America means being viewed as suspicious even when you're a federal law enforcement officer. It means being handled as a threat even when you're doing everything correctly. It means having to validate your humanity and your legitimacy over and over again, even to individuals who should acknowledge you as one of their own. Hayes didn't deserve what occurred to him. The window tint on his vehicle met legal requirements, incidentally. The officer's own documentation later verified that. So the entire stop was founded on a mistaken assumption from the very start, and every choice the officers made following that initial mistaken assumption compounded the problem. If Reed had simply examined Hayes's credentials when first presented, the stop would have concluded in 2 minutes, with a handshake and an apology for the trouble. If Wallace had instructed Reed to release Hayes the instant he spotted the badge, they would have prevented the whole catastrophe. If the sergeant had demonstrated leadership and corrected the situation right away instead of requesting verification, they could have contained the fallout. But none of those actions occurred. Instead, 6 police officers opted to keep a federal agent face down on the sidewalk in handcuffs while a crowd observed and cameras rolled. They prioritized their pride over his dignity. They selected their assumptions over his credentials, and they opted to persist with their error rather than acknowledge it and set things right. That decision damaged everyone involved in ways that can't be completely quantified in dollars or policy adjustments. It robbed Hayes of his sense of security. It destroyed Reed's and Wallace's careers. It drained the city of millions of dollars and years of community confidence, and it stripped the public of another fragment of faith in a system that's meant to protect and serve everyone without discrimination. The dashboard camera documented everything, and what it documented was a total breakdown of judgment, training, and fundamental human decency. This is the outcome when prejudice overrides sound reasoning. This is the outcome when officers notice skin color before they notice credentials. This is the outcome when errors get magnified instead of corrected. And this is precisely why these stories hold significance. Because until every officer handles every individual with identical respect and presumption of innocence, regardless of race, these incidents will continue occurring. The only distinction is that most of the victims won't be federal agents with the authority to challenge the system. They'll simply be ordinary people who get stopped, roughed up, traumatized, and erased from memory. Hayes wasn't erased from memory. His badge and his rank provided him with a platform and resources that most victims of racial profiling never possess. He utilized that platform to ensure his story reached an audience and his rights were upheld. But how many additional cases are out there with comparable stories and no avenue to obtain justice? Consider that the next time you witness a traffic stop. Consider that the next time somebody claims, "These incidents don't actually occur." And consider that the next time you question why certain communities have no trust in police. The camera tells no lies, the footage presents no lies, and the $3,200,000 settlement speaks volumes. Thanks for sticking with me all the way through. If you found this eye-opening, make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss the next one. These are the stories that deserve to be shared, and I'm grateful you invested the time to hear this one. Leave a comment and share your thoughts with me.